Hello everyone, Sana here. Now we are going to listen to podcast news which includes important editorials. While walking in the morning or evening, while cooking, cycling or during free time you can listen. It will enhance your learning and understanding of various accents and pronunciations. Listening improves the quality of communication and comprehension. Before going ahead, I would like to welcome you all to the virtual school. A new way of learning and teaching, with the vision of Let's Grow Together. Our mission is to learn how to learn and teach how to teach. So stay tuned. And here we go. Leaving the past behind, Afghanistan's neighbors must help it protect the democratic gains of the last 2 decades. 2 events in Central Asia last week, which India attended, saw Afghanistan's neighbors seeking solutions to the conflict there. The first was a meeting in Dushanbe, of the Contact Group on Afghanistan of SCO foreign ministers, and the second, a Central and South Asia Connectivity Conference in Tashkent. The meetings also took on a special salience due to their timing. Just days after the US and NATO completed their pullout from the Bagram Air Base, and most other key locations, it is clear that the Taliban are making advances to return to power, by force if necessary. Of particular concern are the Taliban's attacks on border posts, particularly the border with Central Asian countries, and the Spin-Boldak-Shaman border with Pakistan, which are for territorial control and to cut off crucial supply chains to the government in Kabul. At such a time for the SCO ministers grouping that includes Russia and China, India and Pakistan, and 4 Central Asian countries to have issued a joint statement, albeit without naming the Taliban directly, that decried the violence by terrorist groups, was significant. At Tashkent, the host, Uzbek President Shavkat Mirziyoyev, also gave Afghanistan President Ashraf Ghani the opportunity to confront Pakistan Prime Minister Imran Khan for Pakistan's failure to keep its promises on stopping the Taliban from crossing over and ensuring the Taliban conduct peace negotiations in earnest. Despite Mr. Khan's protests, the message is that the region, and global players, will not support the Taliban to enforce its brutal regime in Afghanistan through violent means. For India and the Central Asian states, the worries are about the violence at the frontiers and the resultant refugee influx, extremism, and support to transnational groups such as Al-Qaeda, LET, JEM, ETIM and IMU, as it happened earlier under Taliban rule. As External Affairs Minister S. Jaishankar said, Afghanistan's past cannot be its future, and in an interview to The Hindu, Mr. Ghani made it clear that the Afghan forces will not simply crumble this time. The emergence of the regional consensus to shun any attempt to take power by force will also give the Taliban and its backers in Pakistan reason to pause, and the high-level intra-Afghan talks in Doha over the weekend, and the Taliban's announcement that they will pursue a political solution seriously and to assure neighbors they will not allow Afghan territory to be used against any other country may be evidence that the message has been received. As the future of Afghanistan is decided in the weeks ahead, it is necessary for the neighborhood's voice, Central and South Asia included, to emerge more united and determined to protect the gains the nation has made over 2 decades. Thank you. Editorial 2. Sensitive and precise trafficking needs a wholesome approach that is cognizant of the causative factors. Undoubtedly, trafficking is a pernicious offense, one that societies and governments must have zero tolerance for, and yet, handling the offense of trafficking needs precision, not a sledgehammer. In its current form, the draft Trafficking in Persons, Prevention, Care and Rehabilitation, Bill, 2021 seems to be lacking in nuance, even if well-intentioned, to stamp out exploitative trafficking. The bill, which will shortly be introduced in Parliament, aims at preventing and countering trafficking in persons, particularly women and children, to provide for care, protection and rehabilitation to the victims, while respecting their rights, and creating a supportive legal, economic and social environment for them. This is the bill's second iteration. The first was passed in the Lok Sabha, in 2018, but then meandered into nothingness as it was never introduced in the upper house. Notably, the bill has expanded the area under coverage to include offences taking place, not only within India but also outside it. It envisages the setting up of anti-trafficking committees at the state and national levels to implement the provisions, when passed. In the days the bill was up in the public domain for comments, civil society activists and legal experts have criticized its various provisions, and submitted that an overzealous approach would blur the nuances and an understanding of the contributing factors, including vicious poverty, debt, lack of opportunity, and development schemes missing their mark. Vociferous opposition has arisen over the key aspect of handing over investigation in trafficking crimes to the NIA, both by those who believe that it would burden the already stretched unit further, and those arguing that this move would be an attack on federalism, by removing local enforcement agencies out of the picture. Another key criticism of the bill has been its broad definitions of victims, smacking of refusal to consider consensual sexual activity for commerce. This would only land up criminalizing sex work and victimization of the exploited. Bringing pornography into the definition of sexual exploitation would not allow even for any adult consumption of non-exploitative, consensual material. Reporting of offenses has been made mandatory with penalties for non-reporting, but those with an understanding of the tortuous processes point to the fact that victims often do not want a complaint to be recorded. The mention of the death penalty for various forms of aggravated trafficking offenses needs to be flagged too. The government would do well to scan and incorporate the responses to its bill in order to ensure that the fence does not eat the crop. While sexual exploitation and trafficking can be ghastly crimes invoking public horror, for the state to not employ a wholesome approach, cognizant of the causative factors, one that would be sensitive and precise, would be equally horrific. Thank you. Editorial 3. A tolerant India can be majoritarian. Mere toleration or empirical plurality of cultures is not the same as a conscious democratic project of multiculturalism. Nissim Manathukaren. Getty Images /istock Photogagah Vastard Getty Images /istock Photo. B.R. Ambedkar once said, "Fraternity can be a fact only when there is a nation. Without fraternity, equality and liberty will be no deeper than coats of paint." In a recent comprehensive face-to-face survey, of nearly 30,000 people, on religious identity, nationalism, and tolerance in Indian society, and conducted in 17 languages between late 2019 and early 2020 by the reputed United States-based Pew Research Center, https://pewrsr.ch/3xqqlvq, 85% of Hindus affirmed that respecting all religions is very important to being truly Indian. But, paradoxically, 64% of Hindus think it is very important to be Hindu to be truly Indian. And 80% among them say, it is very important to speak Hindi to be truly Indian, giving credence to the slogan of Hindutva. Rather than celebrating toleration, or seeing the paradoxes as a peculiarity of the Indic mind, it is crucial to recognize that a virulent majoritarian can coexist with the professions of tolerance. It is misreading to treat the latter as a paradox because mere toleration or an empirical plurality of cultures is not the same as a conscious democratic project of multiculturalism or composite culture. Thus, in the last 2 Lok Sabha elections, not a single Muslim has been elected on a Bharatiya Janata Party ticket. This obliteration of political representation of a significant minority, numbering 200 million, which arguably has no parallel in any established democracy in the world, has become completely normalist in India, and is not a matter of discussion at all. Other findings and paradoxes. The survey abounds in other paradoxes. 80%, across all religions, in almost same proportion, think that respecting other religions is a very important part of their own religious identity. 91% assert that they are free to practice their religion. 77% of Muslims believe in the Hindu notion of karma, but when it comes to inter-religious marriages, friendships, and neighbors, there is a marked tendency to keep communities separate. Thus, 67% of Hindus and 80% of Muslims believe it is important to stop women of their communities from marrying outside. 86% of Hindus have their close friends come mainly or entirely from their religion. Scholar Bhikkaparak argues that plural cultures have always existed in the past, but what marks out contemporary multicultural societies is the premise of equality of cultures, and not just self-contained coexistence. The key features of multiculturalism/composite culture are, as Professor Lord Parak asserts, cultures beyond compartments, constant dialogue and mutual change, and a strong streak of interrogation of settled beliefs across all cultures, especially the dominant culture. It is a mistake to see the electoral success of religious majoritarian in recent years as constructed in a vacuum. Instead, it is precisely the decades-long compartmentalization of different religious communities, and the absence of solid state and civil society arrangements in educational pedagogy, personal relationships, workplace, to facilitate intercultural interaction, and based on equality and respect, even under supposedly secular regimes, that has made the soil politically fertile for the demonization of the minority, especially the Muslim, and occasionally the Sikh, as in the recent farmer protests. This is despite the survey breaking the Hindutva appellation of the anti-national Muslim. In fact, 95% of Muslims, and Sikhs, declare that they are very proud to be Indian. India's skyboxification. The American philosopher Michael J. Sandel argued that under rising extreme inequalities of capitalism, there is a skyboxification of American life, in which the affluent classes and people of poor means have no connection at all, and they live and work and shop and play in different places and their children go to different schools. In India, this plays out differently not just in economic terms, but also in religion, and more starkly, caste, the fundamental divide. Every religion is riven by caste. Like with religion, 64% say that it is very important to prevent women from crossing caste boundaries in marriage, and 70% affirm that most or all of their close friends share their caste. Again, the survey brings to the fore the central contradiction of a democratic nation that is divided by compartmentalist hierarchies. Thus, it is vital to note that amidst the gathering clouds of majoritarian, it is a minority of upper castes that holds the reins of power across religions, and it is the lower castes among the religious minority that face the brunt of majoritarian attacks. Glossing over this reality, ironically, reinforces religious majoritarian, and reduces conflicts to merely religion. This can only be overcome by the unison of social groups, especially the oppressed, across religious and caste boundaries. As B.R. Ambedkar recognized a long time ago, the central barrier to the making of a nation is separation in social life. It cannot be eliminated simply by elements like, as the survey shows, a quarter of Muslims and a third of Christians believing in the purifying power of the Ganga, or the same kind of numbers believing in reincarnation, etc. The antidote to the fear of other social groups, especially minorities, often is increased interaction among them in a variety of public and private settings. This is demonstrated in earlier Pew surveys in India, and those elsewhere. In the United States and West Europe, there is a big difference in positive attitudes towards other social/religious groups when members of those groups are personally known. Despite anti-Muslim sentiments, much higher numbers than India are willing to accept Muslims as neighbors. In the Pew survey on 11 emerging economies including India, https://pewrsr.ch/2vvyebv, a higher percentage of the majority community in countries such as Lebanon, Venezuela, and South Africa interact with the minorities than India. Attitudes in South India. But contrary voices to the majoritarian and segregated vision can be seen within the present survey too. In several aspects such as the superiority of one's own religion, having friends and neighbors from other religions, preventing inter-religious marriages, the importance of being a Hindu and speaking Hindi to be a true Indian, prohibition of beef, the attitudes in South India differ, not by a small, but a substantial margin to the rest of India, especially the north and the central parts. This enhanced willingness to break differences permeates both Hindus and Muslims in the south, showing the wider reinforcing effects of increased mutual interaction. Since culture affects politics, Hindu nationalism has had much less electoral success in the south, at least so far. Social reality and complexity cannot be reduced to numbers. After all, one cannot compare attitudes of different social groups blandly without understanding power differences. But quantitative surveys are still necessary tools. Majoritarian, accompanied by mere tolerant acceptance of minority communities as non-interacting enclaves, is the death knell of democracy. To the extent that the Pew survey hints at majoritarian attitudes and compartmentalization, it can only be ignored at our own peril. Thank you. Editorial 4. A new chapter in Nepal's quest for political stability. The Supreme Court order offers some respite amidst the political uncertainty, with lessons for Indian diplomacy too. AFP. On July 12, 2021, the Supreme Court of Nepal handed over a 168-page verdict on a case filed by 149 lawmakers out of the 275 parliamentarians demanding that Sher Bahadur Dubba be made the Prime Minister. Although the parliamentarians had gone to the Supreme Court as Mr. Dubba had gathered enough support to become the Prime Minister of Nepal under Article 76, 5 of the Constitution, President Bidhya Devi Bhandari refused to entertain it. Instead, the President reappointed KP Sharma Oli as the caretaker Prime Minister till the elections that they decided to hold in October and November 2021 were concluded. This ends now. Impact of court intervention. Amidst such circumstances, the Supreme Court verdict has ended the collusion between Mr. Oli and Ms. Bhandari to continuously take decisions that were against the provisions of the Constitution. In December, when the President dissolved Parliament at the behest of Mr. Oli, the Supreme Court ruled against this order and reinstated Parliament. The Supreme Court even had a piece of warning for the President to remind her that the office of the President is also defined by the Constitution and hence, cannot be above it. On Wednesday, July 14, 2021, Mr. Oli left his official residence at Baluwatar which, for the past 3.5 years, had become his office, party headquarters and the centre of power in Nepal comparable to Narayan Hiti Palace during the direct rule of the kings. He left his residence after addressing the nation in a manner similar to when King Gyanendra left the Narayan Hiti Palace on June 11, 2008. His supporters had a procession. The Oli years. In the past, Mr. Oli's popularity rose when he challenged India during the blockade in September 2015 and whipped up nationalism to emerge as the leader who could lead Nepal. For the 2017 federal and provincial elections, the two major communist parties, the Nepal Communist Party, Maoist, and the Communist Party of Nepal, United Marxist-Leninist, UML, joined hands and with a landslide victory, were to provide a stable government in Nepal in 3 decades. This coalition between the two parties had laid out some conditions, one of which was that Pushpa Kamal Dahal Prachanda and Mr. Oli were supposed to rotate the prime ministership. Even amidst these conditions and party coalitions, for the general Nepali public, Mr. Oli came with many expectations. He appointed a technocrat finance minister, a former governor of the central bank, and other team members who, in people's eyes, were perceived to deliver the goods. Prior to taking over, he held various consultations. In one of the long sessions, he gave the impression that he means business. He had a slogan, Prosperous Nepal, Happy Nepali, that appealed to Nepalis both in the country and abroad, giving a feeling that, perhaps, the great moment has arrived for Nepal's transformation. However, the infighting within the ruling party that united in May 2018 began to surface in December 2019. Mr. Oli had, in 2 years of his rule, ensured that his kitchen cabinet ran the country while his image and international relations were being handled by prominent citizens who kept defending him till the end. He unleashed crony capitalism. Many business groups gained from his rule. International relations plummeted with Mr. Oli taking on India with an amended map of the country, which only affected bilateral relations. With the United States Millennium Challenge Corporation, MCC, grant not being ratified, https://bit.ly/3bhclss, ties have been hit as far as U.S. investors are concerned. With China, while he hosted Chinese President Xi Jinping during a whirlwind transit stop, the agreements never saw the light of the day when it came to implementation. The complaints of Chinese investors in Nepal in terms of governance and bureaucracy have been no different than the complaints of others. However, his handling of the novel coronavirus pandemic created a public outcry due to a lack of healthcare facilities. He was personally dragged into the Nepal vaccine scam in the purchase of vaccines from the Serum Institute of India. In his swan song, he tried to take credit for the support that Nepal received, which was more due to the goodwill Nepal has and the efforts of many known and unknown activists who ran from pillar to post in different countries to get support and vaccines for Nepal. Looking ahead. The newly appointed Prime Minister, Mr. Dubba, has served as Prime Minister 4 times but does not have a great track record. He may have won the confidence vote of July 18, picture. But in this, there is a great lesson for India to be learned, on how not to push relationships through intelligence agencies and other tacit ways as it fails each time. This has been seen in earlier decades. India needs to continue to build on people-to-people relationships and engage through official channels of bilateral platforms and diplomacy. Let us not forget that geopolitics is changing as Nepal is now free from being India-locked. Suiyev Shakya is the author of Unleashing Nepal and Unleashing the Vajra, Nepal's Journey Between India and China. Thank you. Editorial 5. Calculating the benefits of lockdowns. Lockdowns need to be guided by trade-offs between harsh and mild policies. Migrant workers in search of work in New Delhi. Sushil Kumar Verma. Data show that as of now 26.2% of the world population has received at least one dose of a COVID-19 vaccine. Of them, only 1% live in low-income countries. By contrast, the richer nations, such as the US, Canada, Germany, and Britain, registered above 50% vaccination by July 17. For India, the percentage of the adult population that has received at least one dose stands at 34.1% as of July 18. How long it will take to eliminate the inequality in the administration of vaccines is shrouded in mystery. Till that happens, long or short lockdowns from time to time will remain the only defense against the virus. Several researchers have studied the effectiveness of the lockdowns in economic terms. It is important, therefore, to take stock of the issues that have materialized in this context. A trilemma. The Economist has come up with a paradox of sorts in an article concerning the trade-off between lives and livelihoods. The article is rooted in the COVID-19 disaster and questions the practicability or even desirability of simultaneously protecting lives and livelihoods with the aid of lockdowns. The discipline of economics, or its dominant school at least, is intimately linked to trade-offs, and its fundamental teaching is that one cannot have one's cake and eat it too. During pandemic-driven lockdowns, this boils down not to a dilemma but a trilemma perhaps. Draconian lockdowns help you to keep on living, but they prevent you from earning a living. With incomes drying up, essential expenditures such as those on food, health, and education cannot be sustained, implying that life cannot be lived. Extreme lockdown policies imply that you cannot quite have your life and live it too, at least not meaningfully. The vicious trilemma needs to be torn down if humanity is to be preserved. This calls for a careful assessment of the severity of lockdowns, their costs, and the resulting gains they hopefully lead to in terms of lives saved. If the expected benefit of a policy falls short of cost, economists will reject it and suggest the adoption of alternative policies, involving an excess of benefits over costs. In other words, one needs to understand the nature of the trade-off. Is the suffering caused by a lockdown sufficiently compensated for in terms of lives saved? The question is probably less simple than it appears to be at first sight. The New York governor, Andrew Cuomo, said, "To me, I say the cost of a human life is priceless." In technical economic language, this amounts to asserting that the monetary price of a human life is infinitely high. If this be so, saving a life calls for endless sacrifice. If such sacrifice assumes the form of extreme lockdowns, then the line of argument precipitates the trilemma all over again. It is counterproductive to start off with infinity. Clearly, the governor had failed to come up with a meaningful definition of the value of a human life. Let us push aside this question for now and estimate instead the cost of a lockdown. Some researchers believe this can be measured by the value of lost GDP. The Economist quotes the case of two European countries, France and Italy. Both imposed heavy lockdowns and suffered 3% shrinkage in GDP. Not that people did not die, but the 3% shrinkage cost of keeping a number of people alive was not insignificant. Similarly, Finland, which experienced a negligible rise in the mortality rate, experienced a 1% fall in per capita GDP. On the other hand, Lithuania performed miserably on its death rate front, but its GDP per person is expected to rise by 2%. The Economist points out yet another horrifying estimate of the cost of saving COVID-19 infected lives. Research, it says, has established that for every infected person cured in poorer countries, 1.76 children die on account of a fall in the quality of life, which is not enviably high even in the absence of lockdowns. This is worse than the trilemma scenario outlined earlier. There are other costs too that should not be overlooked. The horrors faced by migrant laborers in India will continue to jolt our collective memory. One wonders also if life expectancy itself has not been adversely affected in poor as well as emerging economies. Children are held back from school. One cannot rule out the emergence of child labor either. If and when the pandemic takes leave, researchers will surely address the child labor question in India caught in the iron grip of COVID-19. The benefits of a lockdown, seen in isolation, do not appear to be all that clear. Lockdowns, severe or mild, prevent the spread of the disease so long as they last. Mortality falls perhaps, only to resurface once the lockdown is lifted. For the US, a researcher has come up with the disappointing conclusion that there is no life-saving impact of lockdowns at all. How, then, should the benefit of a lockdown be computed? However absurd this may sound, the question takes us back to the value of a human life, which the New York governor had calculated more emotionally than he should have, only to end up in a paradox. Interestingly enough, a good deal of theoretical and empirical research has been done by economists on this issue for the past 50 years at least. The pandemic has merely generated new interest in the subject. The value of a human life. There are many different ways in which the value of a human life may be calculated. A straightforward method is to study the life insurance premiums people are willing to pay to ensure proper treatment if afflicted by fatal diseases. In rich societies, large amounts will be paid. This could well be used to compute the social benefits of lockdowns, which will probably have higher values in rich societies than in poor societies where few are covered by life insurance. Further, all lives cannot command the same value. It is not criminal to ask if an aged person's life has the same value as that of a younger person. This means that a person's own valuation of his life may well differ from the way policymakers are likely to value it. Consequently, the social benefit of lockdowns continues to be a puzzle. This is not to suggest that lockdowns ought to be avoided. Quite clearly, they are unavoidable for now, but they need to be carefully designed, guided by trade-offs between harsh and mild policies. Or else, the damaged economies of the world will not revive too soon. Deepankar Dasgupta is former professor of economics, Indian Statistical Institute. Thank you. Editorial 6. Humanity is the fulcrum of journalism. The core requirement for a media house is to foster humanity. Last Saturday, we had readers discuss various aspects of news coverage, editorial choices, and visual elements at the Hindu's virtual open house. One of the suggestions was to reimagine the newspaper for the next generation of readers. There were intense discussions about how to provide credible information and in-depth analysis for a small device such as a mobile phone. As a news ombudsman, I have one non-negotiable condition. Reaching out to newer generations is a logical necessity. According to the online reference section of Britannica, India's population is young, its birth and death rates are both near the global average. More than half the population is under age 30 and less than 1/4 is age 45 or older. Many newsrooms, The Hindu included, keep debating on what should be the right wordage and mix of visuals and words for various devices. In my view, these essential elements seem to be external factors. The core internal and intrinsic requirement for a news organization is its ability to foster humanity. Rise in online hate speech. The spread of social media has contributed to a substantial rise in hate speech-related violence. The Council on Foreign Relations, CFR, has documented the spike in violence that is directly attributed to online hate speech. It says users' experiences online were originally designed to maximize their engagement. However, with an increase in algorithm-mediated customization, there is promotion of extreme content. An investigation in the Wall Street Journal, How YouTube Drives People to the Internet's Darkest Corners, was on how the site often recommends divisive or misleading material. A report in CFR recorded that in many ways, the debates in courts, legislatures, and among the public about how to reconcile the competing values of free expression and non-discrimination have been around for a century or longer. It is this context that we need credible media outlets that can halt the spread of hate, vitriol, and misogyny and once again work towards an inclusive public sphere. Though no one has quantified the cost of hate that is generated by social media, we are able to sense its corrosive effect on social harmony. A credible news media has two major functions: bearing witness and making sense. The growth of toxicity on social media has delegitimized the act of bearing witness. The recording of pain, the poignancy of loss, and the space for democratic aspirations are filtered through a narrow partisan lens. The photojournalist who bore witness. Nothing illustrates this inhuman delegitimization of bearing witness than the racist campaign on social media against photojournalist Danish Siddiqui, who was killed while doing his job of documenting the newly emerging politico-military situation in Afghanistan. Siddiqui, a Pulitzer Prize-winning Indian photojournalist, was working for Reuters. According to the news agency, he was embedded with a convoy of Afghan forces that was ambushed by Taliban militants near a key border post with Pakistan. In 2018, he won the Pulitzer Prize in feature photography. He won it alongside colleague Adnan Abidi and 5 others for their work documenting the violence faced by Myanmar's minority, the Rohingya. Much has been written about the power of his images of the mass funerals held at the peak of India's devastating second wave of COVID-19. Empathy was central to his documentation process. While I enjoy covering news stories from business to politics to sports, what I enjoy most is capturing the human face of a breaking story, Siddiqui had told Reuters. His untimely death also brought out the pitfalls of the amplification of partisan politics on social media. There were hate posts about Siddiqui, some celebrated his death. The Editors Guild statement explained the significance of a photojournalist bearing witness to an event. After listing out some of the key assignments of Siddiqui, the 2019 Easter blasts in Sri Lanka, the riots in northeast Delhi in 2020, and the devastating human tragedy caused by the pandemic, the Editors Guild observed, his work was therefore a living testament to the axiom of photojournalism: if your pictures aren't good enough, you aren't close enough. Hence, in our quest to reinvent journalism for the new age, we need to ensure that humanity remains the fulcrum of any public discourse. Thank you. Editorial 7. Time to build a valuable economy. COVID-19 has brought home to us the absence from the economy of certain crucial services. Pulapur Balakrishnan. This July marks the 30th anniversary of the economic reforms launched by the Narasimha Rao government in 1991. Evaluations, mainly celebratory, have appeared in the media. A dispassionate assessment would be appropriate, as the economic policy changes of 1991 were the first major changes in the policy regime since the 1950s. The hallmarks of the reforms were lessening of government control and opening the economy to international trade and capital flows. As the timing of the reforms was determined by a balance of payments crisis, it would be natural to assess the reforms in terms of their consequence for this aspect of the economy. In mid-1991, India had foreign exchange reserves that would barely finance 3 weeks' imports. In mid-2021, the import cover is estimated at well over 12 months. Furthermore, in the 3 decades since 1991 there has not been a balance of payments crisis. On the other hand, in the preceding 3 there had been several. This marks a significant reversal. Financial inflows. A disappointing feature, though, is that the foreign exchange reserves have accumulated as a result of financial inflows rather than export surpluses, as was expected. It is now apparent that competitiveness cannot be established by simply reducing government control over the private sector. The history of globally successful economies shows that publicly provided infrastructure, private R&D, and a facilitating government machinery are crucial for a country's export competitiveness. Most of these ingredients have been present in the case of India's software services exporters but are not equally available for exporters of goods. The occasions since 1991 when there has been a trade surplus have been rare. The balance of payments has been shored up by portfolio capital. Such capital can flow out just as easily, leaving reserves to deplete rapidly. The only guarantee against balance of payments stress is a consistently strong export performance. The reforms are yet to take us there. The reforms were also meant to raise the rate of growth of the Indian economy, which they did. Though the acceleration took some time coming, the rate of growth of the Indian economy has been higher after 2001. However, it started slowing progressively after the demonetization of 2016, dropping to less than pre-reform levels even before we were struck by the pandemic. Since then, output has actually contracted, and there is no certainty on how growth will play out in the immediate future. Much depends upon whether there will be a third COVID-19 wave, necessitating the shutting down of economic activity yet again. Returning to the question of long-term growth, it needs to be pointed out that its acceleration after the reforms of 1991 was not the first time it happened. Not only had this occurred before, in the early 1950s and the late 1970s, but also the degree of acceleration had been greater then. In 1991, we were, in effect, dealing with a cash flow problem, albeit in foreign exchange. Now COVID-19 has brought home to us something larger, the absence from the economy of certain crucial services and the underlying assets that enable their production. We realized how inadequate our health system is, as we watched helplessly the scramble for oxygen, the overflowing hospital wards and the overburdened crematoria. But our rickety healthcare infrastructure is merely a metaphor for the absent ecosystem for living in India. Sanitation, transportation, urban governance, and the producer services, from power supply to waste management, needed to undertake economic activity, are all inadequately available. This deficit cannot be bridged by legislating changes to the policy regime as was done in 1991. The necessary infrastructure would have to be first created and then managed to supply the stream of services expected. We have learned the hard way that the value of an economy depends on the extent to which it serves our needs. The current crisis of lives and livelihood in India is the time to start building a valuable one. Pulapra Balakrishnan teaches economics at Ashoka University, Sonipat, Haryana. Thank you. Faith. Instantly obedient. Krishna Avatara is special in many ways. Krishna was born with 4 hands, with his weapons and many adornments. Apart from this, Krishna proved his obedience to his mother even at the time of birth, said V.S. Karanakaracharya, in a discourse. As Rama, he was an obedient son to his father, and he prepared to depart for the forest. But when he went to take leave of Kausalya, she protested and told him not to leave. Should he not have paid heed to her? Obviously, he could not obey both his father and mother. So, he chose the most necessary option, namely obeying his father. But he was concerned about his mother's plight. When Rama tried to persuade Lakshmana to return to Ayodhya, he said he was worried about his mother Kausalya. Who was there to look after her? He was her son and duty-bound to look after her. But he was far away from her, unable to help her in any way. He, Rama, could conquer the entire world with just one arrow, but of what use was this? When he could not stop his mother's tears, Rama asked. Kausalya had reared a parrot, which was so loyal to the queen, that if someone entered her quarters in the palace, it would sound an alarm, and would want to bite the foot of the person, if it perceived him as an enemy. Rama lamented that even this parrot was more caring towards Kausalya than he, Rama, had been. The Lord wanted to make amends for disobeying his mother. So, when he took the Krishna Avatara, he obeyed his mother Devaki, the very night he was born. She asked him to hide his extra hands, so that Kamsa would not harm him, and he at once did so. Ramanujacharya, in his Gita Bhashya, says that he remained so with just 2 hands visible, until he had killed Kamsa. From then on, for the rest of the Avatara, he was seen with 4 hands. Thank you. Thank you so much for watching this video as a podcast. Do like, share and comment. Press the subscribe button and hit the bell icon to get new notifications. Thank you. Take care and stay safe. God bless you all. Jai Ma Bharati. To download news and editorials in MP3, follow us on Telegram, Virtual School Official. The link is provided in the description below.